Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 42. Today we are delighted to welcome to the podcast Sarah LeFanu. Sarah is a biographer who lives near Bristol in North Somerset. Her subjects include the English writer and traveller Rose Macaulay, Samora Machel, the liberation leader and first president of Mozambique, and Marjorie Blandy, one of the early women who qualified as a doctor and who went to France in 1914 with the Women's Hospital Corps. More recently, Sarah has added Conan Doyle to her growing list of subjects when he featured as one of three writers in Sarah's group biography, Something of Themselves, Kipling, Kingsley, Conan Doyle, and the Anglo-Boer War, which was published in 2020 and the following year shortlisted for the prestigious Elizabeth Longford Prize for historical biography. She's recently completed an account of her research and writing of that book, which will be published in October this year, called Talking to the Dead, Travels of a Biographer. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Hello, Sarah. We'll start the questions with what might seem a bit of an obvious one. Those of us who are huge fans of Gothic and genre literature see your surname and straight away think, is she related to Joseph Sheridan LeFanu, the great Victorian Gothic sensational writer and master of the ghost story, who was admired by none other than M.R. James? So, are you related? And if so, what is the relationship?
Well, I am related, and as you might imagine, a lot of people do ask me about that. But I have to say, I am very distantly related. I'll see if I can remember off the top of my head, but I think that Joseph Sheridan's grandfather was something like my 4 times great-grandfather.
Wow.
Me and my brothers are descended from a Peter LeFanu, who I think was the younger brother of, oh goodness, I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, either Joseph's father or Joseph's grandfather. I think possibly Joseph's grandfather. Okay, so it's split quite a long time ago. But I am related. I mean, all us LeFanus are related. Well, he's a fantastic person to be related to. Because he, was, as you say, the master of the uncanny tale.
And from our own perspective, it's one of those where I'm going to have to do a bit of the Michael Caine thing here. Not a lot of people know that, but Conan Doyle himself was a fan of Joseph Sheridan LeFanu's work. And his first novel, or his first published novel, which he worked on in the 1880s, The Firm of Girdleston, has definite influences from Uncle Silas, one of LeFanu's great novels. And M.R. James, when he later wrote an introduction to Uncle Silas, took great delight in pointing out Conan Doyle's cribbing from LeFanu. And he also, Conan Doyle made no secret of the fact, because he had a minor character in the novel called Alphonse LeFanu. So he tipped his hat to the master.
Well, and Conan Doyle wrote some marvellous uncanny stories himself, did he not? But it's really funny, the business about, having a character called LeFanu. I mean, he's not the only writer to have had characters called LeFanu in their work. The great writer, Sylvia Townsend Warner, in her French Revolution novel, which I think was called Summer Will Show, had a Madame LeFanu who ran a stall in the market and sold sausage, I seem to remember. And much more recently, I was reading a story by Tessa Hadley. And lo and behold, there was a family called LeFanu. in
Ah.
it, so that's rather strange.
Yes.
And I'm very proud of that distant ancestry. I've written one or two ghost stories.
Mm.
One of the ghost stories that I have had published was a homage to Joseph Sheridan, my very distant ancestor, and appeared in an anthology which was put together by the writers LeFanu scholars Jim Rockhill and Brian Showers.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Dreams of Shadow and Smoke.
Mm.
And the story that I chose to rewrite or riff on, or however you describe it, was Madame Crowell's Ghost, which I think actually was one of M.R. James's favourites. It's a double ghost story because remember that Madame Crowell is a ghost, but of course there's the ghost of the child in it as well.
And Lefnev, I've always felt with that story, kind of he does takes the opposite to the usual folkloric approach, and we see the ghost of the murderer rather than the ghost of the murdered, revealing the actual location. And M.R. James, absolutely, he did love this story, and he was the one to really publicise when he rediscovered it. When he was trawling through the Victorian magazines to find as much Lefanu as he could. It's wonderful stuff.
I didn't know that he'd rediscovered it, actually. I mean, I didn't know because of M.R. James.
Yeah, it's amazing connections, isn't it? Amazing stuff. Fascinating family connection. And the book that we're going to talk about today is a similarly fascinating piece. Something of Themselves came out 2020. And we both greatly enjoyed reading the book and rereading it in advance of talking to you today. But it's an interesting format for the book. So tell us a bit about how it came about.
Well, I find so often with books, it's, quite a lot is to do with chance. And in this case, a bit was to do with pragmatism as well. So what I mean by that is that my first interest really was the Boer War, about which I didn't know a great deal. I mean, it's not a kind of much publicised war, but I'd been aware of it for a long time, partly because I've done work around South Africa and the history of South Africa before, and Southern Africa. So in a sense, that was my first subject. Also, I was very keen on Mary Kingsley, and I knew that Mary Kingsley had gone, after she'd done her West African journeys, I knew that she'd gone out to the Boer War, and that in fact she didn't come back from there. That was where she lost her life. So I had the Boer War, I had Mary Kingsley. But, when I say pragmatic, what I mean is a book about the Boer War and Mary Kingsley, how many readers was what I thought to myself. And I thought, well, probably not very many. And when I say I thought to myself, one or two other people also said to me, Mary Kingsley, the Boer War. I love writing about writers, and I did think that another way of exploring the Boer War would be to do it through other writers and thinkers. I mean, like they're kind of the most interesting people. Well, they're the people who have the interesting thoughts because they're thinking and writing the whole time. So in a way, I was looking for another writer or another writers.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by pragmatic. I was actually kind of searching for them. It wasn't just that it suddenly kind of came upon me that there was these three writers, and that would be the way to investigate the Boer War. I mean, it could be kind of one thing and then another thing. And when I say that it was kind of chance, I mean, it was chance really that I came, that they were such interesting writers.
Yes.
Their roles in South Africa in the Boer War were so interesting too.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful thing about the book is you split it into three sections. You obviously have the life before South Africa, you have the time in South Africa, and after. And in that first piece, I was really fascinated by Mary Kingsley. I was just saying to Paul before we started that I had read Mary Kingsley's travel writings in West Africa before, but the name had not stuck. And so when I read Something of Themselves, all this stuff came flooding back, and I'd forgotten what a really fascinating character she is. Absolutely wonderful. So I'm not surprised that you started with Mary Kingsley and then worked out from there. So when you came across Conan Doyle and Conan Doyle's connection with the Boer War, was that something that was new to you? And how much experience had you got of Conan Doyle's life and work before starting on the book?
the thing is, I didn't actually know very much. Just like I didn't know very much about Kipling either, or either of their involvements in the Boer War. And that's, I find, always the way that I actually start with a book. I start from a position of not knowing. And then as I do the research, I discover things. Otherwise, that's what makes it exciting. I mean, that's what keeps my interest in it, that I'm finding all this stuff. And I'm thinking, oh, my goodness, I didn't know this. But the thing is that when I look back, it's actually then quite difficult to remember what I knew at the beginning and what I didn't know at the beginning. Because I've thought about it so much and written about it that, now it seems to me as if, I've known that for, 30 years, when I know perfectly well I didn't know about it for 30 years. So one of the questions that I'm not quite certain about is, when did I discover that Arthur Conan Doyle had been in South Africa, had been in what was generally called then the South African War? What I mean is, when was it that I read Memories and Adventures, when he devotes a number of chapters to it? And I can't remember whether that was actually quite a long time ago, and so that I had in the back of my mind, right, I knew that Doyle was involved in this, so he would obviously be one of my writers, or whether it was kind of more recent. But to answer the second part of your question, I didn't know a great deal about his life. So once I'd decided that, that he would be a very interesting writer to pursue and to find out about, I started reading biographies of him, and then the more I read, the more interested I became.
I mean, you've also picked three individuals who in their own way are imperialists, as you've described them in the book, but they're very different flavours of imperialism in this. It really comes out. Can you say something about the different political attitudes that the three had? Because they're really quite varied.
Okay, so Mary Kingsley called herself an imperialist, and the kind of imperialist that she was you could maybe describe as a trade imperialist. What she became increasingly critical of was the way that Britain ran its colonies. Well, the way that it kind of took over places and then ran them from England, from London, basically, without knowing anything about those places, and indeed, much more importantly, their inhabitants. And she felt always, her great friends always were the traders. She was a very unusual woman. She was not your kind of, she was not a middle-class Victorian lady at all. I mean, she was interested in travel and exploration, and in building up these relationships with the people that went to West Africa, for example, as traders, and met with the people who lived there, who were then trading in return. So she saw it as a relationship of respect and equality, and that was what she admired about that kind of approach. And what she really didn't like was people from a distance saying, you must do this, you must do that, and knowing absolutely nothing about what people's lives and cultures were, and not bothering to find out their, what their laws were, how they perceived ideas of justice or social justice, or just, of how they lived. But she called herself an imperialist and was in that sense, but I think that it was quite different from the imperialism of the other two. So Kipling, Kipling was a very complex and kind of contradictory man. But the sort of imperialism that he had, his vision, was one that he shared with, for example, Cecil Rhodes. So it was about spreading British civilization and culture across the world. So he saw it as a civilizing mission. At the same time, I would say he was very anti-triumphalist. So he thought that, that Britain should be careful, and that, everything wasn't completely gung-ho. And I think people kind of misunderstand that about him. However, he was a kind of, in a sense, an old style imperialist, I would say. Conan Doyle, his interest in the South African War was not really an imperialist interest.
No.
I don't think. It was based on his ideas about his passionate belief in ideas of fairness and justice, and so he became very passionate about the kind of instigating factors of the war, which were, or rather I would say the excuse for the war, was the way that now I'm going to use a word that I'm not sure of the pronunciation of, and I have actually been corrected, but I can't remember which was the correct way to pronounce it. Uitlanders or Uitlanders, that is, the people who went over to the Transvaal from Europe and from Britain and from America and from all over, but men mainly, who went over to the Transvaal because of the gold. So there they were, living in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, and they weren't allowed voting rights like the Boers were. The Boers, President Kruger insisted, I can't remember what the exact details were, but there had to be some kind of, length of stay and, that sort of thing. And so there was a big to-do in some circles, and a big to-do that I believe, the British government was very happy to use as an excuse to basically to go to war against the two Boer republics. Now, Conan Doyle, I believed honestly and passionately that these men were being badly treated, that they deserved to have the franchise just like the Boer citizens did, and that it was incredibly unfair. Now, it also has to be said that lots of people didn't agree with him.
Yes.
I think with Doyle as well, there's almost a mixture of naivety and cynicism in his approach as well, in that he had shares in South Africa, so he was interested at that level. But there's also a naivety in his approach. He was never the most sophisticated thinker in these sort of arguments, as you've just pointed out. This very simplistic approach, and it's fascinating that his mother actually disagreed with him hugely on the South African War and saw it as a war for gold and as Milner's war and Cecil Rhodes's war against the Boer farmers who were just trying to live their life. Of course, it was more sophisticated than that. But I've just always found with Doyle there is this strange clash between this naivety and not quite cynicism, but near to that at times.
Yes. It's so interesting, the disagreements with his mother over this, and the fact that he completely blocked his ears to her pleas. Yes. I think it's very interesting what you say about the mixture of naivety and cynicism, because quite honestly, it hadn't occurred to me that his involvement in the war was anything to do with his shares. As soon as war broke out, of course, it was, oh my goodness, our South African shares are going to dip most horribly. But they'll probably rise again later on. Let's not worry about it. But no, that's kind of an interesting thought. Now, I don't really think that he went there. He didn't think that he would make much difference. Anyway.
Oh no, absolutely.
But he always had that very pragmatic side alongside his you could say his naivety, his idealism, his, well, I wouldn't really go so far as to say simple-heartedness, but sometimes there was something a little bit kind of
definitely,
and in the best possible way.
I've always been fascinated afterwards as well, the fact that he gets his knighthood for propagandizing the war. And he doesn't want to accept the knighthood, and it's his mother who told him not to go out to the war is the one who insists he takes the knighthood. So it's a deliciously complex story.
No, you also have, of course, Kipling was offered and didn't take it either, did he? So, they're really interesting. I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about the book is how you're able to contrast the three lives and and the attitudes of the three writers throughout. But I mean, it's a great shame in a way that all three lives didn't interconnect at any one point in time. I do wonder how they would have got on if they would have got on at all had they met.
Well, I think that part of that Doyle's romanticism and idealism extended to his view of women too. And I don't think that Mary Kingsley would have fitted in with that very well. I mean, she spoke with a strong Cockney accent, smoked cigars, and she liked to hang out with people who I think that Doyle might have found rather disreputable. So, so I don't know what he would have made of her. Of course, he would have been polite, just as she would have been polite to him, but she might have teased him a bit, I think.
Yes. I think that would have been fascinating. But she knew the Kiplings, didn't she?
She did know the Kiplings, and they were very fond of her. I mean, they liked her. She was a great raconteur, and they enjoyed that very much. And she was a friend to Carrie, who was at that point going through a very hard time, as was Kipling himself. But of course, being a man, I think that he kept it. Well, I know he kept it, to himself. Whereas I think it was very difficult for Carrie, who was then without anybody. So I imagine. I mean, I don't know, but I imagine that that when she met up just once or twice or three times with Mary Kingsley in or near Cape Town, that she was very pleased to see her. Because Carrie, as you know, Carrie and Kipling had recently lost their daughter. They were coming up to the first anniversary of the death of Josephine, and Josephine was Kipling's best beloved, for whom he wrote the Just So stories. And it had been an absolutely terrible, terrible tragedy, and not spoken of between them either after it had happened. So each one carried their pain inside them. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I think that Kipling was keen to rush off to South Africa soon after the beginning of the Boer War.
Yeah, and there's a parallel there, isn't there, with Conan Doyle? Because I think you talk about how, in a way, Conan Doyle was escaping his own situation to some extent because, of course, his first wife was at that time very seriously ill, and there was a burden on him as actually, you rather tactfully discuss how his relationship with Jean Leckie, his second wife, and where that might overlap to some extent. But there is a sense in which this is Conan Doyle escaping domestic troubles, and I was struck in reading the book again that sometimes it almost comes across like it might have been a bit of a game for Conan Doyle. He seems to be having quite a lot of fun out there, as well as obviously dealing with the serious medical issues. But he seems to be having a good time of it in his own way.
I think he was having a good time. He was having fun. I think I would probably call it an adventure rather than a game.
Yes.
I mean, he just loved adventures. I mean, if there was one thing he loved, I mean, he said something about, the great thing about being close to historical events is that you can take part in them. I think he said that about the Sudan campaign when he happened to find himself in Egypt, but he just absolutely loved to be in the thick of things. But yes, I mean, I think that it was partly an escape for him, and that was, what's so kind of interesting about the three of them. That for all of them, it was an escape from something back home. In their three different ways, from ghastly, confining, dark, cold England full of pain. And when Doyle went out there, he said before he went, I can't remember quite at what stage, but he said something like, this is going to be really good for me. It's going to take 5 years off me. And then there's that a marvellous photograph taken with Doyle and the other staff of the Langman Hospital in Bloemfontein, outside the pavilion of the field hospital, the place that they call the Café Enterique, Boulevard des Microbes. And you look at it, and and when I first saw it, I thought, my goodness, he actually does look younger
He
than
does.
some of the photos of the late 1890s. So I think that it energized him. He said that it energized him.
And it's going back to his roots as well, isn't it? I mean, by then he hadn't been a practicing doctor for 8 years, so he's back into the thick of it again, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you could also argue that it re-energized him as a writer as well. Obviously, with the material on the Boer War itself, the two books, and then what comes not long afterwards is The Hound of the Baskervilles, and this kind of re-energy with Holmes, and it's everything's back, and it is like he needed this break. And to go out and just be in the wide world, but out in the air. I won't say the fresh air, because a lot of that wasn't fresh when he was there, but that outdoor life that suited him, and it re-energized his brain while he was at it.
Well, he always loved the outdoor life, didn't he? There was nothing he liked better than being outdoors, swinging a club or riding a horse, or there's skiing, of course, yes. Terribly keen skier. So, so I think that it really did. And he talked about, you mentioned about not being fresh air. I mean, we haven't talked about the typhoid yet. But when he did get out onto the veldt, he talked about how it was a tonic to be out in that fresh air. And of course, the interesting thing about being out on the veldt, being out kind of on the battlegrounds, as it were, was that the soldiers who were wounded had a greater chance of survival. If they got a bullet wound in a limb, I mean, obviously not in their heads, but, if they were wounded in some way, in the clean air there, they had a greater chance of survival than if they were back in camp, where typhoid was rife. I mean, I have to say, that was something that really, that was an absolute eye-opener for me, the whole typhoid epidemic business. And I think that was really important for Doyle as well. I mean, it really focused his mind.
It focused his mind, and it shows his personality enormously as well, doesn't it? The fact that he was able to get through it and keep on top of things, and it's very sort of maybe the medical training, but also his personality came out that he was able to not collapse under the strain, mentally and physically. Again, he almost thrived on it. It sounds an odd thing to say, but he was in charge, and it suited his personality enormously.
Yes. I mean, I agree with all of that. What I was thinking more, though, in terms of his focus, was his recognition. It was his recognition of why typhoid was so rife, not just in Bloemfontein, but in all the other military camps as well. And and his thoughts about that. So it made him think about the importance of the inoculation, which he had on the way out on the ship, and which he later thought had probably saved his life. I mean, it probably did, in fact. But then he began to think about how the army conducted itself, and how the people higher up the command, how poorly they looked after their men. And he carried on campaigning for that for long afterwards, and I think that it increased his interest in things like preventive medicine and sanitation. That maybe if he hadn't gone out to South Africa, to the Boer War, he wouldn't have come round to thinking of those things, having given up, as you said, Mark, having given up his medical work 10 years before.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. While we're on the topic of Bloemfontein as well, you highlighted a source in the book that I don't think either of us had come across before, which was Charles Blasson was Conan Doyle's dresser. How did you come across that? Because it's quite a remarkable find.
Well, I can tell you very easily how I came across it. I was just trawling the internet. And I came across a reference to this journal called Aide de Camp to Arthur Conan Doyle, or something like that. I can't remember the title of it. And I investigated it, and I saw that it was a a small book, the journal of this young man, Charles Blasson, who'd been Doyle's dresser, a medical student, and it was private. It had been privately published a few years previously, by somebody called Ken Cooper, who was related distantly, like I am, to Joseph Sheridan LeFanu. He is the oh God, I can't even remember actually, but it was his wife's family. So Blasson would have been a kind of great uncle-in-law or something like that. But he had found this this journal in a battered old suitcase that had apparently moved around from one house move to another house move with them, and he never opened it. And then he opened it, and he thought, "Oh, right, Charles Blasson, I know that name." So he started reading it, and almost the first name that he came across was Dr. Doyle.
Amazing.
So that was how I came across it.
Absolutely amazing. And those kind of things are so interesting because so much has been written on Conan Doyle from the perspective of, well, from his own storytelling of his own life and memories and adventures and multiple biographies to actually get the sort of the next big phase of research, I suspect, will be looking at the commentaries of people who knew him at the time, people who actually lived and worked with him and, socialized with him. But to get that kind of perspective at that point in time in his life where he's under pressure at the front doing something of public good, I just think that's a fascinating journal, fascinating resource.
And he had a very nice relationship with Blasson as well. I mean, Blasson had recently lost his father, so he looked up to Doyle, I think, and Doyle was kind to him and kind to the other dressers as well. I mean, in various things, it becomes obvious that not all the officers were particularly interested in their juniors or particularly nice to them, and Doyle was to all of them. He kind of cared about them, and that really, I have to say, that really endeared him to me. And something else that endeared him to me was that, well, Blasson died of typhoid
yes,
on his 23rd birthday, and Doyle wrote this terribly nice letter to his mother, which of course said the usual platitudes about dying nobly and this, that, and the other. Though of course, dying of typhoid was not a very noble death, but then said how fond he'd been of him, and I just thought that was terribly that was so nice of him. And I think that there were, other senior officers who probably would not have thought to do that. I really feel, that Doyle showed that he had a heart then.
Yes, I think the other thing that comes out, as you were mentioning before, was the work he then did on prevention and on sort of related to public health and army reform and things. I think that came out of a respect for the sort of honest Tommy, as he might have seen it too. And Mary Kingsley too had that kind of frontline experience, didn't she? In her own experiences, sadly, very short-lived experience in South Africa too.
Yes, I mean, she was working with the Boer prisoners of war, who were also dying like flies of typhoid. And she developed a respect for them. Doyle, too, had respect for the Boers in a way that Kipling didn't. Although, just to loop back to what you were saying, a little bit ago, Kipling also had a great respect for the ordinary soldier, for the Tommy.
Yes, of course.
And ventriloquized him often, wrote about him with great affection in his stories. And there's one poem in which about some Tommies in Bloemfontein, and they refer to it as blooming typhoid time. But all three of them, in their way, had a respect for the people who, in the English class system, would be seen as below them in rank. And perhaps that was something they were able to express that. I've just thought this, because they were away from England, because they'd stepped for a brief moment, kind of away from that very rigid class-bound society of England at the end of the Victorian era.
on that, the idea of them understanding the Tommy, I think it's also because they themselves were all, Doyle, Mary Kingsley, and Kipling were all outsiders, and I think that will play a part as well. That they all had, their intelligence was that, and much of the background was that of the officer class themselves and their families. But nevertheless, they all had difficult experiences in childhood. They didn't have the easy, smooth route that so many of the officers, certainly in South Africa, who would go through the usual family routes and so on into the army. Some of them will have been to Eton, Harrow, etc. Whereas Doyle, Kipling, and Kingsley all had this really more interesting and general background, and had a lot of trauma in their younger days, and perhaps this gave them that sympathetic eye towards the sufferings of what would be regarded as ordinary people.
I think you're absolutely right. Yes, I mean, Mary Kingsley was an outsider for all sorts of reasons. I mean, first because of her gender. In those days, she was an outsider because she was a woman, but also because of the way that she'd been brought up, and not a normal kind of middle class upbringing. The fact that she spoke Cockney and that her mother was the cook. Mm-hmm. For Kipling, yes. Well, Kipling had been a journalist. He hadn't gone to school or anything like that, had he? He had a job in journalist in India for years.
And also, I think his background in Portsmouth with the brutalising when he was a boy, and you read Bar Black Sheep, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
So he understood people being bullied and downtrodden.
You're absolutely right. And I would say that for Doyle, it was Doyle had a lot of pain in his background, and when by the time he went out to the Boer War, he was like an English country gentleman with a big house and horses, and he always had been a kind of a paterfamilias, because he was the eldest son, and he looked after all the siblings, all his younger siblings, as well as looking after his dearest ma'am, his beloved mother. But actually, it was sort of, it was self-made in a way. I mean, he'd created that himself. He hadn't gone to officer school either, and I think that he could see through that to a certain extent.
And it's this, I think, to come back to an earlier point almost with the image, and Mark will know this is one of my personal real interests in image and so on, is that both Kipling and Doyle in particular, with their appearances, with the big imperial moustaches and so on, that they got characterized through their appearance, and then you read the works and they go against type, and it's great to see that and to read that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Yes, I mean they did. I mean Doyle more so than Kipling, I have to say. I mean, because Doyle was, a big, tall man and kind of very imposing, whereas Kipling was much shorter and very short-sighted. And okay, he had the bristling moustache. And one of the things that I love to think about the image of them when Doyle and his much younger brother Innes went to visit Kipling and his wife Carrie when they lived in Vermont. So this was like 1890 something or other. So 6-7 years before the Boer War, and they played golf together. And I just have this kind of image of Doyle and Innes, who are these kind of big, strapping, fair-haired men. Swinging at a golf ball with really quite tiny Kipling, and then after that holiday that they took together, it was just after that Doyle discovered his passion for skiing, which of course English people didn't do in those days.
Yes.
So he sent Kipling a pair of wooden skis as a present, which I think is marvellous, actually.
I think it was on that same tour that a journalist described Conan Doyle as looking like two policemen rolled into one, which is always my favourite description of him. And then you can imagine him on skis. I was just thinking about the legacy of the three writers as well, the three authors that you feature in the group biography, because obviously Mary Kingsley died in South Africa, and Kipling and Conan Doyle went on for many, many more years. But I was really interested that the Congo Reform Association, which was founded on many of the principles that Mary Kingsley espoused, and also her friendship with Roger Casement, Conan Doyle similarly had an association with Casement. And though he might not have been on the same page as Mary Kingsley, later he became a figurehead for the Congo Reform Association. So it's really fascinating to think about, the legacy of these writers, even though they might not have been entirely on the same wavelength when they were in South Africa.
Yes, I think it's fascinating actually the way that that Doyle became involved in Mary Kingsley's posthumous life in that way. So it was through Casement and also through E.D. Morel. Now, E.D. Morel was a campaigning journalist, and it was he who started the Congo Reform Association and then got other people involved, including Mary Kingsley's old friend, Alice Stopford Green, who was an Irish historian and Irish nationalist. And I mean, she and Casement were very close too. So Morel was a great admirer of Mary Kingsley and what she'd written about, about how about kind of the flaws and weaknesses and awfulnesses of colonial rule. So, as I said, he set up the Congo Reform Association, and it was his pamphlet, which was called Red Rubber. I can't remember the subtitle of it, which Conan Doyle read and was inspired by. Now, I think that partly his involvement was not dissimilar from his involvement with George Adalji, which had taken place, which began like kind of 2 or 3 years before he became involved with the Congo Reform Association. That is, here was somebody who was being incredibly oppressed. I mean, Adalji, I'll just briefly say, was this young man, a mixed race. His father was Indian and his mother was white, and they lived in Shropshire, and he was a young lawyer. And he was accused of mutilating and killing horses, and then of writing poisoned pen letters about it. I mean, the whole thing was completely extraordinary. And Doyle read a report of it and thought, this just seems absolutely amazing. And he really put his heart and soul into trying to clear Adalji's name. And he did one of the things that absolutely convinced him that Adalji couldn't conceivably have done these things that he had been imprisoned for and was sentenced to hard labour as well, was that when he went to see him, he watched him pick up a newspaper and read it, and he held it, like an inch away from his nose and was looking at it sideways. And obviously he was incredibly short-sighted and couldn't conceivably have done these things that he was accused of doing. But anyway, he didn't believe that he was doing it anyway. And Doyle, interestingly, I feel, because when it comes to matters of race, I don't think that he was massively interested when he was in South Africa. I mean, he saw it as a white man's war between Britain and her colonies and the Boers in the republics, and he wasn't really very interested in the majority of the people who lived in South Africa, the African inhabitants. But actually, with Adalji, I mean, he talked about the racial aspect of it, and he felt that the police had joined ranks with, the kind of local bigwigs and establishment because George Adalji was mixed race. Now, I think that he felt very strongly about that, and there was something similar with his involvement in the Congo Reform Association. That is, when he read about what was going on in the Congo, he became incensed at the brutality, and it was more than unfairness in this case. I mean, it was actually the atrocities of what was going on, of what King Leopold of Belgium had been doing there, making it into his fiefdom and torturing and massacring the inhabitants of the Congo for the sake of the revenue from the rubber. And although he didn't know a massive amount about it himself, he really felt for those people.
Yes.
And so then when he, when he approached Morel, and what happened was that Morel, handed over all the details that he'd got, stuff that hadn't even gone into the book, Red Rubber, and Casement, who'd made a report to Parliament on the atrocities in the Congo, also, gave lots of his material to Doyle. And then Doyle wrote this fantastic book called The Crime of the Congo. And you said, Paul, earlier something about propagandizing. Now, the thing is that Doyle became the most brilliant propagandist.
Oh, yes.
Marvelously about causes that he wanted to bring to, to the attention of the public. He was really good at it. He was so good at giving details and being very controlled. And yet you can kind of read the anger. I mean, that's how I feel about The Crime of the Congo. It's a terrific book.
Yeah,
it's fascinating as well. Looking back to the war in South Africa, its cause and conduct, where he's propagandizing for the British Empire. You get The Crime of the Congo, and he's propagandizing against the worst kind of imperialism, the most where imperialism really is criminal, pure and simple. And so he, as you said about Kipling, is an enormously complex man.
I would actually say that I think that there's a difference in, should I say style or should I say quality, in his writing for the war in South Africa and the Crime of the Congo. Because, I mean, both are books of propaganda, but I would say that the war in South Africa, its cause and conduct, is propaganda in the sense that when you say the word in a pejorative way.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
In a good way. And it doesn't have the detail and it doesn't have the discipline about the Congo. It's full of kind of rather generalizations about, how the Boers should do this and how the Boers should do that and what their big mistakes were and stuff. And also he completely shut his ears to any evidence of wrongdoing on the part of the British.
Yeah. Because the purpose of it was to persuade the world that Britain was right. And part of him probably knew, we've got to suppress certain things. But and whereas, as you say, with The Crime of the Congo, this is from the heart.
Oh, yes.
This is really heartfelt stuff and red raw anger.
Yeah, and astonishingly, it was written in a matter of days, wasn't it? It was matter, I think he'd internalized the argument so much, and he was so boiled up with passion around the subject that it all came out. It is a remarkable piece of writing. We'll have to go into it in a bit more detail sometime. We are running quite close to time, so I'm going to ask you about what you're working on next, Sarah, because I know we said at the outset that you've got a new book coming out next month, I think.
That's right. I've got a book coming out, which is it's based on the journal that I kept while I was researching for and writing Something of Themselves. So it's sort of it's like the kind of the underbelly, maybe, of that book. I'm very interested in the whole process of biographical writing and how you do it, and kind of what's hidden in the finished product. So what this book, which is called Talking to the Dead, Travels of a Biographer, what I hope that it does is that it shows, everything that goes into what makes the finished book. So it does talk about my position of not knowing about things, and of not being certain, it starts, in fact, with the first trip that I made to South Africa, to Bloemfontein in 2015, when I knew a certain amount about Conan Doyle and Kipling and their time there in Bloemfontein. So I was wanting to see if there was any kind of trace of them, and I spent a lot of time chewing my fingernails and thinking, what kind of a book am I possibly going to write? Because I didn't see any trace of them there.
Yes, of course.
which was kind of, but you have to start from that place of not knowing, I think. So it's, so this book, Talking to the Dead, does, I hope, just kind of give a glimpse of that part of the biographer's work. Also, it covers a lot of the libraries and archives that I spent time in, which maybe makes it sound very boring, but they're so important, libraries and archives.
No, we're big supporters of libraries and archives.
I mean, just seeing people's handwriting.
Yes.
Conan Doyle's lovely copperplate. Oh, so easy to read.
And makes a delicious reading as opposed to M.R. James's absolutely appalling handwriting, which Paul and I have both tried to decipher at various times, and no chance.
It's very interesting to hear your approach with the new book as well, Sarah, because I'm a huge fan. One of my favourite books is A.J. Symonds' The Quest for Corvo, which is, again, almost started the meta biographical approach with his biography about biography and the biographer's role, and it's great to hear that you're going to be taking this path, and it be absolutely the biographer's journey is, or the historian's journey is often as fascinating as the story that's being told ostensibly. So I really look forward to this.
Well, thank you. And and I feel, gosh, I hadn't actually thought about Corvo in this context, but you're absolutely right. I mean, gosh, well, how nice to be kind of mentioned in the same sentence as him.
Well, look, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast with us, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming on. We really enjoyed the book. We encourage everybody to go out and buy a copy if you haven't already. We'll put links in the show notes, but we hope to have you on again sometime to talk about your next work.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Well, what a fascinating discussion with Sarah. We really covered a lot of ground there and discovered quite a lot, not just about the book and the origins of it, but also her method. So it'd be interesting to read more about that in the future.
Oh, and definitely, absolutely fascinating. And it's always really good to talk about these sort of aspects of Doyle's life, to get the kind of the non-writing side of his life, and particularly where he is caught up in genuinely historical events, and to get the views on this. And it's just, I found the whole thing really interesting, and I thoroughly recommend the book to anyone out there. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's all we've got time for this episode. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're interested in supporting the podcast, then please consider either leaving a rating or review on the podcaster of your choice, or you can sponsor us on PayPal or Patreon, and details can be found at the website. So, Paul, what are we doing on the next episode?
Well, it's a few months since we touched on Sherlock Holmes directly. So the last one of those we did was The Final Problem. So it seems quite logical to continue with the next episode with The Empty House.
Great. So that's for next month. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Hoppy, me old horse. Since when are you in London?
Got back yesterday, sick leave.
Uh-huh.
I've been searching for you all over the city.
Yes?
I'm terribly sorry to hear about your leg. Jumping jars of that, they're both there.
What the hell do you think I was standing on?
I thought you had a wooden leg.
Why should I have a wooden leg?
They told me at Bloemfontein they cut off your left leg.
Can't have, old boy. I'd have known about it.